Okay,
It's on.
it's on. Eric is one of those marvelous people who fell into my life on a vacation the whole family made to a marvelous resort in Mexico at the base of a living and exuberant volcano. And it was called Mahakua in those days, owned by who was the Goldsmith.
Sir James Goldsmith, the British billionaire.
Right. It had been his vacation home, one of many. And I sit down to lunch with Eric and his partner, Barney Carpfinger, and introduce myself. And I don't know if it was Eric or Barney who said, "Are you Charles Levy?"
No, I'll tell you the story, Barbara.
Okay.
We got onto the subject of who did what, and Barney asked you what you did, and you said, "Oh, you know, it's." You tried to brush him off, and then he said, and you said something to do with books, and he said, "You're not the owner of Charles Levy and Sons, are you?" And you said, and I quote, "I hope there are no children in the room. How the fuck did you know that?" And it turns out that Barney Carpfinger, my partner, is a literary agent, and he had clients who were going to be meeting in at Barbara's company just the next week.
Right.
So it was turned out.
Shared, as they say in Spanish.
Shared.
But Tolly, after that, my daughter was living in New York, and Eric and Barney took very good care of her. And they danced at both girls' weddings. And one of the interesting things for me, Eric and I connected on such a deep level that when we were leaving in the van, he came running out. We looked at each other. I got teary. And from that point on, we've been very, very close friends. So it was quite a wonderful idea to have him speak. I love the work he's doing. I followed it for years, helped where I could. And you're on, my friend.
Great. So thank you for inviting me today, Barbara. And what I'm going to be sharing with you is some of my work. I am the host and the founder and host of the Making Gay History podcast, which draws on an archive of more than 100 interviews that I did for the 2 editions of a book called Making Gay History. Making Gay History was published by then Harper and Row in 1992 in a first edition, and then in a second edition in 2002. It's an oral history of what was then called the gay and lesbian civil rights movement. I started out in life as a journalist, actually started out as an urban planner, but then shifted to journalism. And Making Gay History was my second book. I had no intention of writing a history book. I would never have thought to take on that, well, to even propose such an idea. But I had a call from an editor at Harper and Row who was an acquaintance of mine. And he said, would you be interested in writing a proposal for a book about the gay and lesbian civil rights movement, an oral history like Studs Terkel's work? And I said, I was working at CBS News at the time. I was a segment producer for CBS Morning News. And I said, why me? I'm not an academic. I know nothing about this history. And he said, well, I liked how you did dialogue in your first book, which was called The Male Couples Guide, which was, I thought, a benign book about couple relationships and who does the dishes and how do you get life insurance and all those things. But it was the first book of its kind. And he liked how I did dialogue. And he said he also wanted a non-academic. He wanted a commercial book that people could actually read. So I was very unhappy at CBS at the time, and I took on the challenge. He ultimately bought the book, and I started work on it in November of I started the summer of 1988 when I started work on the proposal. Signed the contract in the fall of '88 and began my interviews in December of 1988. So what I'm going to share with you today, actually to fast forward to 2015, I was trying to figure out what to do with the rest of my life. I was in my mid-50s and didn't want to write books anymore. And I had turned over my entire collection to the New York Public Library, and they'd agreed to digitize it when I donated the collection in 2008. And for years, I'd been nudging them about getting to the digitization process. So I called them up in 2015 and I said, where is it? And they had just finished digitizing the collection. I had a series of conversations with friends about what I might do with my archive. And one of them was the executive director of a foundation based in New York. And he said, I don't know what you're going to do with your collection, but I'd be very interested in supporting your work. So come back to me. And I did. I came back to him with a project. It was an education project. I was going to work with, I do work already with my education partners at History Unerased. And the plan was to provide them with short excerpts of the interviews I did for my oral history book that they would then use to anchor 8th and 11th grade curriculum on American history. And by the way, if you can't hear me at any point or if I've frozen, just let me know, signal me. I'm in upstate New York and sometimes the squirrels aren't running fast enough in the cage to keep things going. So I hired my neighbor, Sarah Birmingham, who was a former BBC producer and NPR producer, to work on this project. And when she got down to about 15 minutes, when she edited these 3-hour interviews down to 15 minutes, she said, this sounds like a podcast. And to make a long story short, she went to podcast school, but she hadn't made a podcast before. And while she was at podcast school, she met one of the professors who ran one of the hottest podcast production companies in the country. And she loved what she heard. And she said, how can we help get this launched? So crazy as it might sound, 5 weeks later, we launched the Making Gay History podcast. That was 4 years ago. We've had 3.2 million episode downloads. We've produced more than 80 episodes. We've been downloaded in 200 countries and territories around the world. We now do education work. We train educators to teach this material. I work with both History Unerased and an organization called, I always forget their names, Facing History and Ourselves, a national organization that produces educational resources for K through 12 on LGBTQ history. So what I'm going to do with you today is share excerpts of some of these interviews. And I'm going to take you through the history of the LGBTQ civil rights movement quite quickly in about 45 minutes. And then we'll come back for questions. So I'm going to share with you my screen. Give me one moment. So this is an audio tour through LGBTQ history. And I'm going to play for you. So one of the people I really wanted to interview for this book was a woman named Edith Ide. But her pen name, which is the only name I had to go by when I was doing my research in the late 80s, was Lisa Ben. And if you've ever played word games, if you rearrange those letters, you get lesbian. So most of the people in those years in the movement in the 50s and 60s used pseudonyms. So I went to, when I finally found Edith Ide, or better known as Lisa Ben, I went to interview her because she had published the first newsletter for lesbians in 1947 on her office typewriter at RKO Radio Pictures in Hollywood. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. But I also discovered that Lisa Ben, Edith Ide, sang in the gay clubs in the 1950s and 60s. She didn't like the entertainment at that time, which was typically drag queens who told derogatory jokes about gay people, playing to the straight people who would be allowed into the bars in the evenings to watch the girls, the lesbians, dance. Sounds creepy, it was. So what you're going to hear first is an excerpt from one, you're going to hear one of Edith Ide's songs, but listen very closely to the lyrics. Hang on one second.
Hey. Yeah, I need to warm up a little bit. I should tune up a little bit first. Hello, young lovers, whatever you are. I hope your problems are few. All you cute butchers lined up at the bar. I've had a love like you. Stay cool, young lovers, and follow your star. Stay cool, be faithful and true. Don't mess around with the opposite sex. It won't do a thing for you. I know what it means to wear customized jeans and go out for a casual cruise. You saunter on by, and that glint in your eyes speaks of hope you can never quite lose. Don't cry, young lovers, because I'm alone. I've a stockpile of wild memories. A gay senior citizen, all on my own. At least I can do as I please. Senior life has compensations, my friends, and at least I can do as I please.
That person you heard applauding was me. It was an audience of one. And I don't know why I thought to ask Edith to play her music for me. She played 45 minutes of her songs, which is one of the, well, it's actually the largest recording of Edith's music anywhere. When I started work on this project, I had no idea that the movement, the gay rights movement, started before 1969 and the Stonewall Uprising. So it was a revelation to me that there were all these people who were doing things to try to change the world long before 1969. So as I mentioned, my primary reason for interviewing Edith, and it took 25 phone calls to find her, was because she wrote this, what she called a magazine. We might call it a zine today, or really a newsletter. She worked as a secretary at RKO Radio Pictures in Hollywood. And her boss told her that she wasn't always going to be busy with work, but he didn't want her to look like she was doing nothing. But he didn't want her reading or knitting. So she did what any other person would do. She decided that she would type a newsletter for lesbians on her office typewriter. She used 5 sheets of carbon paper, typed it through twice. She published 9 editions. And you can actually find them all on my website at makinggayhistory.com. We do essentially a magazine article with every episode, with links and archival photos. So her newsletters have survived. And what struck me about one of the newsletters in particular was this column that she wrote. It's called the Whatchama column, where she shared her thoughts and feelings and hopes for the future. And in this one particular issue, she fantasized about what life might be like one day for gay people. So this was 1947 when she wrote this. So this is a clip from that interview.
It was just some writing that I wanted to do to get it off my chest. And I was a very lonely person, and I could sort of fantasize this way by writing the magazine, you see. And then, I'd write the end, the whatchamacallum, and that was just ideas that happened off the top of my head that I would write about and say, wouldn't it be wonderful if, not fantasize exactly, but imagine about how things might be in the future with us.
What were some of the things you imagined?
Well, I imagined that perhaps we would have a lot of magazines and that perhaps even movies might be made about us. I would hope that someday we would not be looked down on with so much disdain.
Well, I think this may be where this is the column, this is the article, Here to Stay. September 1947, Volume 1, Number 4. Whether the unsympathetic majority approves or not, it looks as though the third sex is here to stay. With the advancement of psychiatry and related subjects, the world is becoming more and more aware that there are those in our midst who feel no attraction for the opposite sex. Homosexuality is becoming less and less a taboo subject, and although still considered by the general public as contemptible or treated with derision, I venture to predict that there will be a time in the future when gay folk will be accepted as part of regular society. That's pretty bold stuff.
Well, I guess it is. I never thought of it as being bold at the time. I was just, as I say, I was just sort of fantasizing. But it all has come to pass.
And it has. One of the things that struck me about Edith was how isolated she was. I called her on several occasions after that interview, and every time she answered on her black rotary phone, she said, "Hello, Eric." And I said, well, how did you know it was me? And she said, well, nobody else calls. She died at age 95 in a nursing home. She felt she had to go back in the closet when she went into the nursing home because she was afraid that she would be treated badly by the staff of the nursing home. And when she died, there wasn't a single obit published anywhere about her and her contributions. I have pitched her to the New York Times. The New York Times does retrospective obituaries of people who are forgotten. And I've pitched her, and I'm still hoping that one day someone will publish an obituary of Edith Hyde. So moving on to the next person. Oh, excuse me, let me get to the right place. So I had a letter recently from somebody who was concerned that I really didn't pay attention to Chicago in my archive. And the truth is I have only one story about Chicago in the archive, and that's the story of Shirley Willer. And I was limited in my time and budget for the book. So I focused on the coasts and then picked places in the middle of the country to interview people. Shirley Willer was actually living in Key West at the time. So I was interested in talking to Shirley Willer because she was the president of an organization, a national organization called the Daughters of Bilitis. That's Bilitis, the Daughters of Bilitis, which was founded in San Francisco in 1955 by several lesbian couples. And it was meant to be a social group initially, became more political as time went on. When I met Shirley in Key West in 1989, she was a mountain of a person sitting in a wheelchair with an ashtray on the arm of the wheelchair piled high with cigarettes. She had a flat top haircut. Her hair was silver. She had Coke bottle thick glasses, no teeth, and she really scared me. She called herself, she's a self-identified Big Butch, and she said that caused her problems in life because people just assumed she would take the man's role, and she could never get a date for that reason, but she was actually quite shy. And she scared me at first, and I realized, and this happened over and over again while I was doing these interviews, I had my own prejudices and preconceptions about people based on how they looked. And Shirley was a softie. So Shirley told me the story of how she came to be in the movement and what drove her. That isn't the part that I'm going to play for you. She worked in a hospital as a nurse, and after the war, all the Army corpsmen who came back went to work in hospitals. And she had one friend in particular who worked at the hospital where she worked, who was in a terrible accident and was burned very badly and was treated very poorly in his care at a Christian Brothers hospital and died. And she said anger drove her a lot in her life. So the excerpt that I'm going to play for you now is from an experience she had going to a Halloween ball in Chicago. Now, gay people were not allowed to cross-dress. No one was allowed to cross-dress. It was against the law, but on Halloween, gay people could dress up, and they had these large balls every year in Chicago. And this is Shirley telling about her experience of going to one of the balls shortly after World War II.
Big events in Chicago were the Halloween balls. Aragon and Trianon. There were huge ballrooms, one on the north side, one on the south side. And every Halloween, all bars were off. And everybody went in costume. And all of us would get tuxedos and
All the women.
all the women.
Uh-huh.
And dress in our butchiest styles. And we'd all go to the balls. The Aragon was on the north side, the Trianon was on the south side. These two particular big events were, again, run by the mafia. And we'd hire limousines, you see, and get a police escort through the crowds in order to get inside. And
This is the one time a year gay people could
one
be gay.
time a year that gay people could be gay. It was the only visible sign that there literally were thousands and thousands of gay people in the city.
When was the first time you went to this? In the 1940s?
It was shortly after the fellows got out of service, because I remember they dressed me
How did they dress you?
in a tuxedo
Uh-huh.
and tied my tie and put makeup on me. I'd never worn makeup in my life.
Shirley died only about a year after I interviewed her. One of the joys for me in doing this project was that I got to record the stories of people who were at the very beginning of the movement in the US, whose stories would have been lost otherwise, because many of them had never been interviewed before, certainly never recorded. In the mid-1960s, Shirley traveled the United States to start new chapters of the Daughters of Bilitis, and where she couldn't interest enough women, she would help the men start chapters of the Mattachine Society, which was an organization started by 5 men in Los Angeles in 1950. And she was funded by a benefactor who went by the code name of Pennsylvania. It was a wealthy woman. I don't know where she lived. And she donated the equivalent of $100,000 in the 1960s to help fund Shirley's work. I have tried to find out who Pennsylvania is, and apparently Shirley was the only person who knew who she was, so her identity is lost to history. The oldest story that I have in my archive is from a man named Wendell Sayers, who lived in Denver, African-American. He was in his 80s when I interviewed him, and he talked about the experience of being sent to the Mayo Clinic when he was 16 years old in 1920. The reason I interviewed Wendell is because I had heard about him from another activist, that Wendell had attended meetings of the Mattachine Society in Denver in the 1950s, and then attended a national convention of the Mattachine Society in 1959. I found it mind-blowing that there were already conventions of the early gay rights organizations by the late 1950s. So this excerpt is where Wendell talks about having been to the Mayo Clinic. He's been diagnosed as a homosexual. He was told that he should be incarcerated, scared him to death, and he's on the way home with his mother, driving from Rochester, Minnesota, back to Western Kansas, and he's worried about what his father will say. So 16 years, this is a story about when he was 16 years old.
So we went back home and reported to Dad. I'd like to say this, that I was an adopted child. Mm-hmm. And I often used to wonder as a kid, what will he do when he finds it out? See, will he put me out or kick me out, or will he accept me? My dad was very understanding. I say understanding, I don't think he actually understood, but he was willing to accept, I should say. Mm-hmm. So he finally told me, he says, well, since they don't know what to do about it, find you a friend that you can trust and bring them home. I don't want you playing around on the streets or out on the country roads, because you never know who's going to step up behind you or step up on you. Bring them home. What you do in your room is your business, because he didn't want me out on the street.
It astonished me that Wendell was accepted by his parents. As he says later in the interview, he said, "Mother just adored me, so there's never a question." I didn't imagine that people were accepted at that time in the 1920s, certainly. When I was leaving Wendell, I was on his front steps saying goodbye. He said, "Do you think it's too late for me to meet somebody?" And I lied. As I said, it's never too late. But I knew from what Wendell told me that he was so isolated that the odds of him meeting anybody at that stage of his life were very slim. He had had 2 gay friends in church, both of whom had died of AIDS, 2 young men. So there was nobody, he had no connection of any kind with a gay community in Denver. Wendell, in some ways, for me, exemplified the experience of so many of the gay men and women of his generation, that they lived in terrible isolation. So Wendell's family accepted him, but many of the people I interviewed were not accepted. This next person who I'm going to introduce you to is Sylvia Rivera. Sylvia is iconic in the movement because Sylvia was one of the people who was allegedly at the Stonewall Uprising in 1969. This photo is from 1970, when Sylvia was 18 or 19 years old. She's become a trans icon because she identified as a trans person later in life. This photograph was taken by Kayla Husen, who you'll meet later in this presentation, who was a journalist, a lesbian, who photographed the movement. So I'm going to play a short excerpt of Sylvia's interview. And I should tell you, Sylvia scared me to death when I went to interview her in 1989. She lived in a tenement house, in a tenement apartment building in a small river town north of New York City. And I got to the lobby of this broken down building, buzzed on the door, the buzzer, and the door opened at the top of this long staircase, and then this person stepped out onto the landing under a bare light bulb and was dressed in what I came to learn was something called scare drag. And scare drag was a form of drag that was meant to scare straight people. It was a sort of form of, really a form of protest. But Sylvia was in scare drag, which she explained was partial drag. She had her, her hair out, full makeup, bright red lips, a skin-tight t-shirt with a tank top over, I'm sorry, a skin-tight tank top with a blouse over it tied at the waist and stretch pants tucked into chunky boots. And I had never met anyone like Sylvia in my life. I grew up in Eastern Queens, actually not far from Donald Trump. And I lived a rather isolated life. And even though I was 30 at the time and had been out for a decade, I had never met anybody who did drag before. But I walked into Sylvia's kitchen. I was welcomed by her boyfriend, and a close friend of hers, Remy, who is a lesbian who was as butch as Sylvia was femme. Now, Sylvia wound up on the streets at age 11, very, very effeminate. And there was no place in the world for Sylvia at that time. She was living with her grandmother. From what I've read, her mother killed herself. And Sylvia left her grandmother's house and lived on the streets from age 11, making a living as a hustler. And when I asked her about how challenging it was to make a living on the street as a child, she said, oh, it was easy. When you're that age, it's easy. So this is Sylvia's recollection of the Stonewall Uprising. And for those of you who don't know, this was a bar raid that took place on June 28th, 1969. When gay people challenged the police, it led to 6 days of conflicts with the police on the streets of Greenwich Village. And it blew the gay rights movement wide open. It shifted from a small movement of only 40 to 60 organizations with maybe 400 or 500 activists in June of 1969 to a year later, there were 1,500 organizations across the country with many thousands of activists. So this is Sylvia Rivera describing her memory of the first night of the Stonewall Uprising.
To be there, you know, it's just like, oh, it was so beautiful. I just like, you know, it's like.
Was it exciting?
Oh, it was so exciting. It was like, we're doing it. We're doing it. We're fucking their nerves. The cops were, you know, they just panicked. Inspector Pine really panicked. Mm-hmm. He really did. Mm-hmm. Plus, he had no backup. Mm-hmm. He knew. He did not expect any of the retaliation that the gay community gave him at that point.
Do you think all this was in part because people were so angry for so long?
People were very angry for so long. I mean, how long can you live in a closet?
Hang on to that thought for a second about anger. I'm going to come back to it. But first, I want to tell you there was a problem with this interview. I have come to discover through one of my friends wrote a book on Stonewall, the definitive book on Stonewall called Stonewall. And through his research and also through my own interviews, it turns out that Sylvia was not at the Stonewall Uprising the first night, that she made up the story. It is historically accurate. What she describes is exactly what took place, but that she was very concerned about placing herself at this important moment in history. She became an important activist in the years after, although often disruptive. She co-founded an organization called STAR, it was called Street Transvestites Action Revolutionaries, and set up a safe house for young gender nonconforming street kids, which lasted about a year. But Sylvia was hardly in a position, given her own life experiences, to create a safe space for other kids, younger kids like herself. So So I haven't quite figured out what to put on my website yet about the fact that Sylvia was not there the first night and very likely wasn't at the uprising at all, because Sylvia has become such an icon in the movement and is spoken of as this important figure who played an important role in the uprising. So for the moment, I'm doing nothing and just letting Sylvia speak for herself. And this is one of the challenges with oral history. Oral history is history as we remember it, as we would like to remember it, and as we would like to remember ourselves in it. So I don't present my book as fact or the podcast as fact. These are people's memories, and memories are fallible, and they're also malleable. And I just find it interesting and challenging. So the idea of anger. When I interviewed people, I asked them, I said over and over again, boy, that was courageous what you did. I can't imagine doing that. That took such courage. And over again, people said to me, no, it had nothing to do with that. I was angry. People were angry about the things that were done to them, that were done to their loved ones. They were fired from their jobs or beaten, or as in Sylvia's case, wound up on the street as a hustler at age 11. But also people were driven by something else. They were driven by love. Many of the people I interviewed found their way into the movement because they wanted to meet someone. So they joined an organization so they could find a girlfriend or a boyfriend. So this next excerpt I'm going to share with you is from Joyce Hunter. And Joyce speaks about anger and how it motivated her work. She was born to a 16-year-old Orthodox Jewish mother in the Bronx and an African-American father. Her family wasn't happy about it. His family wasn't happy about it. And Joyce spent most of her childhood growing up in group homes. She tried to kill herself twice, wound up in a psychiatric hospital. The psychiatrist she saw told her, if you marry, and she shared that she had feelings for girls, she was told, if you marry and have children, those feelings will go away. Well, they didn't. Joyce ultimately divorced. She was very involved in the early days of an organization that was really the successor to Star House. She was one of the first employees of an organization called the Hedrick Martin Institute for the Protection of Lesbian and Gay Youth, founded in the late 70s. It's an organization that exists to this day that provides all kinds of services to street youth in New York and in New Jersey. She was also a co-founder of the first alternative high school in New York City for LGBTQ youth who couldn't survive in the public schools. And that's what you see in the background. There's a poster in this photograph that says Harvey Milk High School. So in this very short clip, Joyce talks about what it was like, or how anger fueled her work in the movement.
One of the things that the movement did for me, it gave me a vehicle to express my anger.
What were you angry about?
Everything. That I had been denied my life, that I had no adolescence. My childhood was robbed. I always say that when I come back in the next life, I want to come out at 2, and I want to be able to enjoy being who I am.
Joyce is one of the few people I interviewed who is still alive. She's in her early 80s. She has 16 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren, and is married to her partner of 33 years. So I want to introduce you to Deborah Johnson and Zandra Rolland Amato, and they are examples of regular people who get confronted with a situation that they think is unjust, and then they go to court. They'll tell you the story of what happened when they went for a romantic dinner that went south. This is in Los Angeles in the early 1980s, and they wound up hiring a lawyer who didn't yet have a reputation that she does now. They hired Gloria Allred to represent. So this is the story of Deborah Johnson and Zandra Rolland Amato, who went for a romantic dinner in 1983 at a restaurant called Papa Shoe in Los Angeles, California.
At the time, I was working on Saturdays. So this was the first weekend that we were going to have a complete weekend together since we had gotten together. It was also the year right before Martin Luther King's birthday was made into a holiday. And a friend of mine told me about this restaurant that was really nice. And the restaurant had these 6 booths on one side that were real romantic. And we got there, and the waiter kind of questioned us about, are you sure you want the booths? And we told him yes. And it's the type of booths where you have to move the table out so that you can get in, like a horseshoe. And in the middle of the horseshoe was like a fountain, and there was a guy with a violinist who came around, and the booth right in front of the table was a little white sheer curtain that closed in the candlelight, and it was just romantic.
Did it occur to you that this might be a problem?
Not at all. I mean, to me, discrimination never enters my mind first, ever. So they showed us to our table, we sit down, and we're taking our jackets off, and this tall, humongous guy comes by and yanked the table away and told us, so sorry, but you can't sit here. It's against the law
and
to serve two men or two women in these booths. And we asked to see the manager. And we weren't going to move. The guy that turned out to be the real maitre d' kept giving us the back of the bus type of thing, well, you can sit over there and you can sit over here and you'll have free drinks and the whole thing, but you cannot sit here, you will not be served here. And kept insisting that it was against the law. It was against the law. And that really, it makes me crazy thinking about it. It made me more mad. So you got to remember, we were there about Martin Luther King's birthday, and then we were going to take it off the next day as this real show of solidarity and its importance in the whole bit. And if there's anything the King had taught us, it was that we could sit anywhere in the restaurant we wanted to sit.
Deborah and Zandra are examples of individuals who decided to challenge discrimination. And this happened over and over again. Often individuals were ahead of the movement, where some of the organizations, the formal organizations, the gay rights organizations, were reluctant to bring court cases. Individuals, when faced with discrimination, decided to fight on their own. They actually won their case. It was based on a California law that prevented discrimination against people based on their sexual orientation, but it had never been tested before. So they won their case, and then the owner of the restaurant held a press conference, had all of the romantic booths dragged to the curb, and said, on this day, romantic dining dies. Just like the pools that were closed because they didn't want to integrate them, this restaurant owner decided to no longer have romantic booths because he wasn't going to serve same-sex couples. So there, it just seems so pathetic to me. Perry Watkins is an example of another person who decided to challenge discrimination. I'm guessing none of you has ever heard of Perry. I had never heard of him until I interviewed him. He was drafted in 1968 at the height of the Vietnam War. He had been studying dance, and he was 18 years old. He'd been studying dance in Europe and flew back to Tacoma, Washington, where he was from, expecting that he would fill out the form, check off the box that said he was a homosexual, and be on a plane back to Europe, because the military didn't take homosexuals, but they took him. And then they wouldn't let him go. He was in the military for 15 years, an exemplary career before he was thrown out. And I'll tell you more about that right after I play the clip for you. But I couldn't believe that they actually took Perry. And this is the portion of the interview where Perry's trying to convince me or persuade me that, in fact, that was the case. Here's Perry Watkins.
I was not trying to go into the military. That's why I told them that's why I find it absolutely ludicrous that the Army is in court saying, we don't want this man. Well, why the hell did you take me?
Right.
And why am I the one that is being accused of being at fault? It is amazing. But no, I checked the block. Yes, they sent me into a psychiatrist who said to me, why did you check this box? Yes. And I went, because you asked me to fill the form out honestly. Well, did you object to going in the military? No, I didn't want to go in the military. Who did?
Right.
But I certainly had no objection to serving my country.
You were raised to be honest.
Extremely so. Why I really checked the box was because I thought, if I go into the military, I'm not going to hide the fact that I'm gay. I know myself well enough to know that. So when I get thrown out, Mom will be angry if I lie. That was why I checked the box. When I get put out of the military, Mom will be more angry with me for lying than why didn't I just tell the damn truth to begin with?
When I met Perry, he was living in a rented house in Tacoma, Washington. He was 8 years into his court case. He was thrown out of the military without any benefits. He went bankrupt. He lost his partner. He lost his house. And it was cold in his house. He couldn't afford to have the heat on, so we had our coats on. He ultimately won his case. He was one of the first people to be reinstated in the US military after being thrown out. He decided to take a settlement in the end, was celebrated in the 1990, I believe it was the 1992 march on, the Gay Rights March in New York City as a Grand Marshal, and then he died of AIDS in the mid-90s. Long forgotten, but I'm glad that I was able to capture his story and that people can get to know him. And when I asked him about this court case, he said he never wanted to be the kind of person who had to sue the government, but he wasn't going to put up with the discrimination, and ultimately won his case. I'm guessing all of you know who Dear Abby is. Does everybody know? Yes, okay. When I speak to young audiences, they of course don't know who Dear Abby is, and I have to describe her as, if you took Oprah and Ellen DeGeneres and wrapped them up with every Instagram influencer they follow, they wouldn't be nearly as big as Dear Abby was. Because everybody read Dear Abby when I was growing up. So one of the important roles that straight people played in the movement, particularly before actually even to this day, was that they could speak at times when nobody would listen to gay people. And certainly in the 1960s, when Dear Abby started responding to mail on gay issues, people listened to Abby in a way that they didn't listen to the activists, or the way parents wouldn't listen to their own children. And she wrote affirmative things about gay people. And I have to tell you, she was one of the most, I was more excited about interviewing Abby than interviewing Al Gore or Ellen even. And I interviewed both Al Gore and Ellen. Abby was iconic to me. I remember pulling up to her house in 1989 in Beverly Hills. She lived in a French provincial Third Empire, I don't know what it was, but it had a mansard roof and double height front doors. And I rang the doorbell, and Dear Abby opened the door. And she was dressed in lavender hostess pajamas and pink fluffy slippers. She said hello, and I said, how would you like to be addressed? What should I call you? She said, just call me Abby. And she invited me into her house, and we sat in her kitchen, and I did the interview with her there. So this excerpt that I'm going to play for you, it begins with a letter that she's received from somebody who's very concerned about people who've moved in next door who are very obviously gay. And this is Dear Abby explaining what her response was to that letter.
There was a column that you wrote. This is the woman who complained about the new neighbors next door, a strange man, the couple.
Well, the letter was, this is a nice neighborhood, and we're very disgusted with these types. And what could we do to improve the neighborhood? And my answer was, you could move. The gays thought it was hilarious. But other than just being amusing, entertaining, there was a good message there.
Which was?
They have a right to be. If you don't like it, you could move. Because they have as much the right to be them as you have to be yourself.
Mm-hmm. How much of an impact do you think you've had as one person on this issue?
I think I was I was one of the first person on the national level that wasn't gay. I wasn't defending myself. I was defending everyone's right to be themselves, gay, straight, no matter.
And that was in the beginning of the 1950s.
It took, people tell me it took a lot of guts, but I was happy to have a platform such as I had.
I tried to find out, I really struggled to find out from Abby how she came to have her very positive and supportive attitude towards gay people. And it took a while to get there, but she had a hairdresser named Cloyd. And she was as close to Cloyd as anybody and got to know his family. And that's how she came to know gay people initially. Next up, and I only have 2 more clips to play for you, and then I'm happy to take questions. Barbara Giddings and Kay LaHusen got involved in the movement early. Barbara Giddings got involved in the 1950s. Kay joined the movement in the early 60s when she went to a picnic where she was looking for other people like herself. She met Barbara. They fell in love and were together forever after. Kay is still alive. I just spoke to her the other day. She's 90. She lives in a retirement community in Pennsylvania outside of Wilmington, Delaware. Now, the reason they're holding dinosaurs there, and this is an example of their sense of humor, I call them the happy warriors of the movement. They had the best time fighting for equal rights. So they were among the few activists from the pre-Stonewall movement, which was called the homophile movement, who survived and thrived in the immediate post-Stonewall movement, when a lot of the older activists were swept aside by younger people who had more radical views and didn't respect the older activists. So in the fall of 1969, Barbara and Kay went to a meeting of an organization called the Gay Liberation Front in New York City, a new activist organization. And they were called out and said, "Who are you?" You know, these old people in their 30s in the back of the room. And they were called dinosaurs. So at the very next meeting, so Kay went out and bought a couple of stuffed dinosaurs and brought them to the next meeting and carried those dinosaurs with him to every meeting thereafter. So the clip that I'm going to play for you is is a story from 1971. Barbara, who's on the right, got very involved with the American Library Association because she first found herself in books. And that's what I heard from lesbians over and over again, that they first found themselves in books. And one book in particular, The Well of Loneliness, which was published in the 1920s. So at the American Library Association convention, Barbara and Kay had set up a booth on the convention floor. They rented a booth. They produced a bibliography of all of the positive gay and lesbian books that were available at that time, which filled 2 sides of a legal size sheet of paper. And they posted the bibliography all over the convention hall, in the elevators, everywhere. They had them available on the floor of the convention where they had their booth, and nobody paid any attention. So they decided to do something to get some attention. So imagine this booth on the floor of the convention. And I'll let Barbara and Kay tell you what they did with that booth to get people to notice them. 1971.
Well, we decided to bypass books and show gay love live. So we called it Hug a Homosexual. And we stripped it down to the bare gray curtains, and we had a sign up, men only at one end and women only at the other. And we stationed ourselves, all 4 of us, under the signs to give free, mind you, free same-sex kisses and hugs. Well, let me tell you, the aisles were jammed, but nobody came into the booth.
And Life magazine was there.
Life magazine photographer was there. 2 Dallas television stations had sent camera crews.
Right,
and I think people were rather
around.
intimidated. Yes, the lights were on, and all these people jammed in the aisles, craning their necks to see the action, but nobody wanted to take part. So we did the action. We kissed and embraced each other for 2 hours. We handed out copies of the bibliography. We called out encouragement. We kissed and hugged each other some more. Alma Rout was an absolute peach. She and I were on the female end, and a couple of the men were on the other, and we did all this ourselves. That really put us
there
on
we
the
were
map.
on the 6 o'clock news, and the library
And again-
people were livid. They said, we have all these famous authors here, and all they cover is this kissing booth.
They put us on the 6 o'clock news. They put us again on the 11 o'clock news, and again the next morning. This was news.
Speak the local.
Yes.
Denver?
Dallas. It was wonderful. And it really, our spirits soared because really the booth also had a message that was useful in any arena. And that is that gay people are not willing anymore to be subject to a special double standard. If we should have the same right to express our affection publicly as heterosexuals have. No more, but no less.
Barbara was formidable. Kay was background, or I should say was in the background. She's the photojournalist who took that picture of Sylvia Rivera that you saw earlier. She was also very strategic in working with Barbara and a man named Frank Kameny in organizing gay psychiatrists to have homosexuality removed from the list of mental illnesses in 1973. There's a new film that will be out shortly and will be on PBS next year called Cured. And it's all about how that process unfolded, and Barbara and Kay were instrumental in making that happen. And it's really hard to explain now or to underestimate the impact on gay people of having that sickness label removed. Because how can you be a doctor if you're sick? How can you be a school teacher if you're sick? How can you be a lawyer if you're considered mentally ill? So their roles in the movement were key. So whenever I call Kay, and we speak every couple of weeks, she always says to me, "What have you got?" She wants to know what's going on out there. And she wasn't sitting idly in the retirement community when she and Barbara moved there. And now she's there on her own since Barbara died. Kay started a gay table at this retirement community. And when she told us about that, because I visited with Kay, with my producer, we went to interview her to get an update. We had to go back and spend an evening with Kay's friends at their gay table. And so we did a bonus episode, which you'll find on our website, with Kay and her gay friends at the nursing facility. And you cannot believe the stories that each of them had. So we asked each of them to fill in a blank. I made gay history when? And every single person at that table had extraordinary stories. So I just adore those two. And if you want to hear more of them, we did 2 episodes with them, plus the bonus episode. You can find them on the website or actually wherever you get your podcasts, if you listen to podcasts. So in this final piece, this is Vito Russo. Vito was famous when I was young for having written a book called The Celluloid Closet. It was about how gay and lesbian people were portrayed in film. He was a film historian, worked at the Museum of Modern Art, and his theory was that Hollywood helped shape all of the negative stereotypes about gay people. And he lays it out in this book, which was brilliant. And I found his book, I was a temp worker at Harper & Row Publishing, later HarperCollins, in 1981. And I found Vito's newly published book on the shelf of one of the editors. And I didn't take it down until the lunch hour. I was sort of out, but not really out, and was afraid that anyone would see me reading it. And then I had an opportunity, only 7 years later, I'd been commissioned to write this book. I had an opportunity to interview Vito, because Vito wound up being a co-founder. Besides writing this book, he was a co-founder of GLAAD, which was the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, and a co-founder of ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. And the reason I wanted to interview Vito was because of his book and because of his activism, but he was one of the first people I interviewed because I knew he was dying of AIDS. His boyfriend had already died, and Vito didn't likely have much time after that. So this is Vito Russo reflecting on legacy and life's meaning, which I think a lot about as I get older and older. So this is Vito Russo, 1988.
I find it interesting, from what I know about the history of the gay movement, that there always have been and there will always be people who are willing to put their lives on the line for these ideas. Starting from Germany in the turn of the century in 1895 around, and then into the early teens and 20s, there were a group of people in Germany headed by Magnus Hirschfeld who were willing to put their lives on the line. They were willing to make a movie called Different from the Others, which the Nazis seized and burned. That in the 1940s and the 1950s, there were the Harry Hayes and the Barbara Giddings and the Mattachine Society. And then in the 60s, gay liberation. It's the more radical issues that I think are still going to be fought over, whether gay people have a right to adopt children, get married, teach in the public schools, which they do now, you know, but be open about it.
Right.
And those battles are battles that are going to be fought long after you and I are gone. But you have to make a contribution while you're here. I mean, that's been my whole life, is to leave my book behind, that I know after I'm dead, that book is going to be on a shelf someplace, and what I have to say will reach people. And the things I've written, you know, because it's like, who was the person who said that? Pedro Almodovar. He said, the thing is you can't regret your life. Otherwise, why did you live? What was the point of having a life if you didn't say something or do something that was going to survive after you're gone. And that's the way I feel about it. I mean, I really feel the reason why I'm here is so that I could leave this book and these articles so that some 16-year-old kid who's going to be a gay activist in the next 10 or 15 years is going to read them and carry the ball from there. And that'll happen. Happened with me. Harry Hay passed the ball to Mattachine, and they passed the ball to us.
And you'll pass it on.
I really adored Vito. I got to know him a little bit better after that. I saw him a number of times after that. And I really felt that he had passed the ball to me back in 1988. And when I talk to young audiences of high school students or college students, I talk about how he handed the ball to me, and that now I am handing the ball to them, that they have this heritage, this legacy, that most of them knew nothing about until they heard this presentation or listened to the podcast, and have discovered that they have ancestors, people with a proud history who've been fighting for decades to make possible the world in which they live today. So that wraps up my talk. My social media team would be upset with me if I didn't tell you we're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can find us in all of those places. Instagram at Making Gay History Podcast, Twitter at Making Gay History. We're also on Facebook. And we also have a newsletter. If you go to makinggayhistory.com, you can sign up there. We're on I'm going to stop sharing just now. We're on hiatus at the moment. We're just producing our fall season, which will begin in October. We're working in partnership with the Studs Terkel Archive in Chicago. We're taking a deep dive into Studs Terkel's archive, which is extraordinary. And we have found some gems, including a 1977 interview with Christopher Isherwood, who talks about having lunch at the Sexuality Institute of Magnus Hirschfeld in Berlin. This is, Vito just mentioned Magnus Hirschfeld. Magnus Hirschfeld founded the first gay rights organization in 1897 and founded a Sexuality Institute in 1919 that was then burned by the Nazis in 1933. And Isherwood, in his interview with Studs Terkel, talks about having lunch with Magnus Hirschfeld. So that will launch this coming October. And one of the interviews in Studs Terkel's archive is a 1992 interview with me that Studs did when my book was first published. And we'll include a couple of excerpts of that in our preview for the season. So I'm happy to take any questions that anyone has.
No, I'm going to jump in. I know you know this, but I wanted to say this for our fellow Zoomers. I don't know if everybody is aware how important Chicago was in the very early gay rights movement in the United States. Henry Gerber's house, who is actually within a short walk from most of where you all live, and it's a national landmark in Old Town. It's on Curly Court. And Henry Gerber founded the first chartered gay rights organization in the United States in 1924 or 25. 24, the Society for Human Rights. And he also published the first publication, Friendship and Freedom. Unfortunately, once the authorities found out what this was all about, and the story is quite funny because the vice president of the organization turned out to be married to a woman. Well, of course, a woman in those days. And she ratted them out to the postal authorities and to the authorities, and they suppressed the organization. So, but it's at least a little bit of a part of Chicago history, and also recognized both as a city landmark and as a U.S. landmark. So those of you, when you feel like it, could go over to 1704 Crilly Court and see the house that he lived in during the time he put this organization together.
It turns out that this organization was instrumental, and I'll tell you how. So Henry Gerber knew Magnus Hirschfeld, who founded the first gay rights organization in Germany in 1897. Henry Gerber himself was an immigrant. He was German. And so was aware of Magnus Hirschfeld Institute and his work, and brought that idea back to the US, founded his organization in 1924. And then Harry Hay, who came up with the idea of the Mattachine Society in 1950, knew Henry Gerber. So you can trace this thread, and we do this in one of our podcast episodes about Magnus Hirschfeld. You can trace the thread of the movement from the present day back to LA in 1950, back to Chicago in 1924, which was a pivotal moment, back to 1897 in Germany with Magnus Hirschfeld. So when people today say that the modern gay rights movement began in 1969, I always say, modern? What wasn't modern about a gay rights organization founded in Germany in 1897, or Henry Gerber's group in 1924? So when people talk about the movement beginning in 69, what happens is you wind up dismissing the contributions of all of these people who came before, who were incredibly brave. And Diane, I saw you had your hand up.
Yes, I just wanted to mention there's a fabulous book about gay life in Chicago called The Boys of Fairytown. Do you know this book?
I don't know it.
Oh, it's, you just got to go get this book right away.
You want to read this book?
100 years of gay history from, I think, starting in the 1840s, going to the 1940s. And the stories are just unbelievable. And it's sort of the chronology of gay life starting from that time, and very, very, very well documented, because there was a professor of sociology at University of Chicago who had all his young students go out into the field and actually went into all of the neighborhoods where there was just extraordinary things happening. You've got to read this book. I mean, when I read it, in fact, I have sent this book to all my producer friends and people who I know who used to head studios or still head studios out in LA. And I know one of them has found a producer who I think is working on this now to make some kind of miniseries or film. It is just amazing. You got to get this book.
What's the title? The Boys of
Fairytown. And the thing that was extraordinary for me personally is all the activity that was right around the neighborhood where I live right now. Just fabulous, fabulous.
Eric, first of all, thank you. But with this group, you notice everybody writing things down. We never get together without notepads because there's always much to. Hi, Anu.
Hi, Anu.
I've been listening right through. I'm cooking, which is why I stayed off the video.
You know, I knew nothing. I knew no history whatsoever. I knew my friends and I knew what they had been through in high school and in college. We were fairly open with each other, but I didn't know any history of the movement.
Yeah, it's well, and no one is taught this history. I'll give you an example. Making Gay History has been made into a play, which premiered on February 28th in New York at the Provincetown Playhouse in Greenwich Village. It was produced by the Steinhardt School at NYU. It's a documentary theater play called Making Gay History Before Stonewall. It takes 20 characters out of the podcast, and they're not characters, they're real people, and brings them to life on the stage in a 90-minute play. And we brought in 2 student groups, and one of the student groups, one of the young women asked, and these kids were mostly kids of color from schools in the region. One young woman said she wanted to know more about this one character, one person, who had been a mentor to Dr. Martin Luther King. She was African American. She was asking about Bayard Rustin, who was Martin Luther King's mentor. He was the principal organizer of the 1963 March on Washington. And before I answered her, I said, how many of you have studied the civil rights movement? Everyone's hand was in the air. I said, how many of you have ever heard of Bayard Rustin before today? None of them had. And the reason they hadn't been taught about Bayard Rustin, who was this key figure, was because he was gay and he was out. So all of this history is right there. LGBTQ history is intertwined with American history. It's part of the American story, but it hasn't been taught. And often I hear from young people who say they're embarrassed that they don't know anything about this. And I always say, well, you shouldn't be embarrassed. There was no reason for you to know this. You weren't taught this. This isn't part of school. But part of my work has been, and one of the real joys of my work, is bringing this work to schools and providing the resources for educators to teach this material in school.
Shama?
I would be very interested. I thought your presentation was fascinating. I'd
Thank
be
you.
interested. Did you interview the man who owned Papa Roche? Perhaps he has moved on from his ignorance. That would be such a humane thing, that perhaps he was wrong then and he has grown since.
It would be. But I haven't. I think one of the failings of my work is that I didn't interview people who were in opposition to the movement. I did interview a couple of Republican congressmen, which was as far as I got. But I wish I'd interviewed Anita Bryant, for example, who led a campaign against gay people in the late 1970s. She used to sell orange juice on television. You may know her from there. But it really didn't occur to me at the time to interview people. But yeah, it'd be really interesting to know what Papa Schuth thinks now. And I still, I don't have the bandwidth to do new interviews, but I really would love to interview Anita Bryant to find out how she feels about the campaign, the national campaign she led in the late 70s to repeal gay rights bills across the country. And she was quite successful in demonizing gay people. Her campaign was called Save Our Children. Save our children from the homosexuals. It's a great question.
Sherry?
Yes, Sharon.
Unmute.
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 Yoo-hoo.
While Sherry's trying to unmute, I just want to say that in the late 70s, and I don't know how many years, but we went to the gay ball every single year, all dressed up and having so much fun.
So you went to the successor ball, to those early balls that Shirley Willer spoke of.
Yes, they
Yes.
was wild. It was absolutely great. And I was married to a man, and we went with another straight couple, and we just fit in great.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
Barbara, are you able to unmute Sherry?
I'm trying right now. I think Sherry's unmuted. But
Sherry,
it's
when
not.
did you publish your first book?
Well, my first book, The Male Couples Guide, the idea came up over dinner. I was with my then partner, my first partner, and another young couple. We were all in publishing. We had been together, the other couple had been together for 3 years. Each of us been together 3 years. And we were talking about couple stuff and who does the dishes and life insurance, because it was during the AIDS crisis already. And my partner and I had just gotten life insurance. And I said, gee, I wonder if there's a book out there on the subject. And one of the guys across the table said, I don't think there is. And if there isn't and you're interested in writing a book, I know people in publishing. And to make a very long story short, I worked with a friend of mine who was also in publishing on a proposal for 8 months. I bought a book called How to Write a Book Proposal. And it sold immediately. And the editor asked me how long I thought it would take to write the book. I had no idea. I said 7 months. And I wrote the book in 7 months. And it was published in 1988. It was called, 88, called The Male Couples Guide, Finding a Man, Making a Home, Building a Life.
Oh, beautiful.
And I wasn't really fully out when I did that book. And so we got so much attention for that book, it turned out. And I was on television, radio. It was an extraordinary experience. And also there were a lot of awful people out there who said terrible things when I was on call-in shows. So I got a lot of practice dealing with people who hate gay people.
And that was before social media.
That was before social media. Yeah.
You should be thankful for small mercies.
Yeah, Sherry, I can see you can't, for some reason you can't unmute, but do you want to put your question in the chat box? If you click on chat, you can type
Barbara,
in your...
her other identity on this is showing it's unmuted. So I'm wondering if there's another one that you can see for her.
Well,
you unmuted her. You muted her other one.
I show they're both on mute. Oh, now the second one's off mute.
Right, but that's why I noticed that. So, but the one with her actual face is muted.
It's not allowing it.
Eric, hi, can you hear me? I have a question.
Yes, Alan, yes.
Hi, hi. First of all, sorry to come late to this. It's really, there's a lot going on. We had a bit of a drama, but it was fascinating when, just as soon as it got in, it was so compelling. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I had a question about the two women during the ACT UP meetings, the dinosaurs.
Yes.
And you said that there's kind of some animosity towards them being older. And I was just kind of wondering whether that continued or whether there are other kind of conflicts within the movement at the time.
So they attended, it was not ACT UP actually, they attended a meeting of the Gay Liberation Front in
That's right.
1969. This is true across all social movements. You can see it now with even Black Lives Matter and the relationship with older activists in the Black Civil Rights Movement. Although there's a better relationship there, I think, than there was between older activists in the gay rights movement in 1969 and younger activists. I think every generation arrives on the scene with different expectations because they arrive on the scene where the world they experience is the baseline. And they feel that there's a lot yet to be done. And for those who were in the movement from 1950 to 1969, nearly 20 years, they saw extraordinary changes in the world already. But for the people who arrived in 69 and 70 and were 20 years old or 22 years old, it was just the beginning. So even today, there are tensions between younger activists and older activists, and there are plenty of misunderstandings. And even for me at age 62, almost 62, I find it's challenging to keep up with some of my younger friends now in the movement, and just with language. Just for example, LGBTQ plus was LGBTQ just a year ago, and 3 years ago it was just LGBT, and when I started out it was just L and G, and adding B was a big deal. And there were no issues around gender identity, or at least there were not issues that were considered a part of the movement. So I think it's just typical of any social movement that younger people arrive on the scene and are automatically antagonistic toward the older folks and think that they're accommodationists and haven't done enough. But one of the joys for me in sharing this work with younger people is they have an opportunity to see the risks that were taken by prior generations at times that were far more challenging than the ones in which we live now.
Eric, you also wrote several fantastic books on suicide. Could you talk about those?
Yes, you give me more credit than I deserve. It was one book on suicide. So the way I've approached my career is, my book career was, I wanted to write the books that I wished had been on the shelves when I was a young person. And when I was 12, my father killed himself, and in 1970. And no one knew what to do with a 12-year-old who had just lost his father to suicide. In fact, they didn't tell me that he killed himself. They said it was pneumonia, but I actually knew from the first phone call what happened. And the lesson I took from the fact that no one would speak of it was that it was something so shameful, it could never be spoken about. So when I worked at Good Morning America in 1987, this was just after I'd submitted the manuscript for my first book, The Male Couples Guide, I decided that I would write a book about suicide loss and how to cope with suicide loss. So I spent my lunch hours going through the clip files at Good Morning America, looking at every article on suicide, and wrote a book called Why Suicide? Questions and Answers About Suicide, Suicide Prevention, and Coping with the Suicide of Someone You Know. And I look back now and I see it served two purposes. One was to provide a book that I wished had been around when I was a child. And the other was it gave me an excuse to do research and to interview relatives at a distance, at a remove, because it was such a painful experience for me that I couldn't approach it as a non-journalist. I approached it as a journalist. And I remember writing the introduction to that book in the house where I'm sitting now, just upstairs. This is our weekend place north of New York City. And I wrote the opening paragraph of the introduction about the impact of my father's suicide and how it blew apart my family, and irreparably. And I wrote that sentence and burst into tears. I couldn't write for weeks after that. I've done two editions of that book. I thought I had written a lot about my own life in that first book, and that's how I often do my books. I thread my own life experience through the book. And I went back to look at the original edition after my partner's sister killed herself 10 years ago.
Oy.
Yeah, Oy is right. 11 years ago. And I thought the book needed updating. And I got my agent to persuade my editor to do a new edition. And I went back and I did a lot more interviews about people's experience around suicide loss, and went back and interviewed more family members about what happened. So that's actually two key parts of my work: suicide loss and homosexuality. I was at a convention when I tried to change careers and work in real estate development. And I went to a convention in Las Vegas, and I was with a group of people talking about shopping malls. And someone asked me about what I did. They knew I'd gone to graduate school midlife and changed careers. They said, well, what did you do before? I said, well, I wrote books on homosexuality and suicide. Not homosexuality and suicide, but, and one by one, they walked away. More typically what happens, and I can only laugh about that, but more typically now when I share my experience about suicide, almost every person then shares their experience with familial suicide or the suicide of a friend. It's something people talk about more than in the past. And my other major area of interest now is the Holocaust. I also produce a podcast called Those Who Were There, Voices from the Holocaust, which is drawn from Yale University's Fortunoff Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies. And we have produced a full season last year, and we're just now producing a second season, which will launch in September.
Diane just introduced me to this incredible young woman. I'll send it.
Can't see it.
All right.
Edda Hellstrom.
I'll send it to you.
Okay.
Amazing.
You know, this started with Barbara talking about not wanting to be in large groups of people. And you said how the room sort of cleared when you mentioned that you did things. And this is actually a good way to find the people in the room that you want to talk to.
Yeah.
I found striking up comments on mortality does it amazingly at say a charity event. Other people find things to do, and you're left with the two people at the table who are really interesting to talk to. Right. So you can think of it as a useful way to find people to talk to.
Yeah.
Yeah, mortality. And Shari, you have to unmute. I've tried unmuting you and I can't.
I've heard other people talk about simply pressing their space bar down. Does that work for you? Press the space bar on your computer down.
I think the problem is Shari is signed on in two places.
Yeah.
So
but she's, I've released her.
From one of them?
I thought from all.
It's not the muting, Barbara. It's that Shari is signed on as two different people and two different boxes.
Could
so,
she perhaps log off and log back in?
Yeah, if you log off, Shari, from both places where you're logged on, and then rejoin.
I don't know how to do that.
Oh, there you are.
Talk.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. You talked about a young man named Vito. Was it Vito Rossi? Okay. He was talking about the influence in Hollywood and how it promoted it. There is a series on Netflix called Hollywood.
Yes.
That is terrific.
Yeah.
And it's very open, and you love who you love.
Yes.
What's the difference?
I loved that series. It was a complete fantasy. It was Hollywood as if
should be.
It had opened up in the.
Loved that.
Yeah, it was, for me. It was just such. It was in some ways so stupid and so.
Yes.
And I loved every minute of it.
By the way, Sherry, there is a movie that was made of The Celluloid Closet, which is Vito's book. It's nowhere near as good as the book, of course, very rarely. But it might be something you could, if you want to look at, if you care to.
Yes, there's The Celluloid Closet is the movie, the documentary, and then there's also a documentary about Vito's life called Vito.
Yeah. right, which is on Netflix, or that's still available on one of the streaming services.
Yeah.
But the book is good.
The book is good, but the book is unfortunately out of print.
Yeah, that's.
Yeah, you can get it through used books.
Advanced Book Exchange is marvelous. Abe, you can find a lot of things.
So Eric, I'm just curious, what is the state of things for young runaways in New York City right now? You know, if you watch the documentary Paris is Burning, that was sort of like an era where where boys were first sort of started to be taken off the streets a little bit, but but those kids didn't last very long. I mean, they died pretty soon. I'm just wondering what's the state now. Is there more help for the children?
There are places to get help, but it's still very grim. And there are many thousands of homeless street kids. They're typically gender nonconforming, often trans, often kids of color. It's grim. It's really grim. In some ways, it feels like we haven't gotten anywhere, but it isn't true. We have gotten somewhere, but there aren't nearly enough social services for young people who've had to flee their homes for various reasons. And it's not just gender nonconforming gay kids, but the majority of the kids on the street of New York are gender nonconforming and trans LGBTQ youth.
So with your expertise, what would you think could be the best help for those kids in a perfect world?
Yeah, there's an organization you might be interested in learning about. I mentioned it earlier because Joyce Hunter was one of the early employees, called the Hetrick Martin Institute for the Protection of Lesbian and Gay Youth.
Okay, say that again slowly.
You don't need to, I'll give you the full name, but it's an easy web address. The Hetrick Martin Institute for the Protection of Lesbian and Gay Youth. Emery Hetrick and Damian Martin were a gay couple who founded the organization in the late 70s. Both died of AIDS. And I interviewed both of them, actually. If you go to hmi.org, that's the organization.
HMI, okay.
hmi.org. It's an organization that provides all kinds of support services for LGBTQ youth. The problem is we have a greater societal problem. It isn't just the LGBTQ street kids. It's kids who wind up in foster care and then are dumped at age 18 on the street. So there is no easy solution as long as we have a society that has such a shredded safety net. And at times it really feels hopeless to me. So there are still kids selling themselves on the street, still kids getting infected with HIV and coming to New York on buses and trains because they've been thrown out of their homes. And they come to Chicago too. Yes.
Eric, this is tied up to what Diane was saying. I think there's some place called Center on Halsted in Chicago that does a lot of work with LGBTQ children who are finding homeless place to stay while they're kicked out. Did you come across, I think the person there, the ED there had said, there was a huge problem with the African-American community because a lot of them through religion kicked them out. So they're accepted in a less rate than the non-African-American community.
Yeah, yeah.
Is that true?
African-American and Hispanic as well, yeah. Yeah.
I was just curious, I don't know much, but historically, Madhu can say this better than I could pinpoint. There's a Mughal emperor. I don't know if it's Akbar or Jahangir or one of them. I find all this LGBTQ perspective very interesting from the non-Christian point of view. The British made it illegal in India. Before that, I don't know if you ever talked about it, but I know Akbar or Jahangir, I don't know which one, along with their multiple wives, they had hundreds, if not thousands of pleasure boys set aside for them. The whole approach to this is very different in different cultures. Have you interviewed in that?
I have not done interviews in that regard, but I do know about it, that the Western attitude towards homosexuality is just one, and that there are cultures in which gender nonconforming people and people we would identify now as homosexual were accepted in part of the culture. It was part of Native American culture, part of cultures, Indian culture as well. And then the Western culture dominated and dominates still, so that the Western standards about homosexuality were imposed on societies all across the world.
I think what I meant, maybe I'm wrong. I wasn't meaning it in terms of homosexuality. It was just lumped together under sexuality.
Yeah. You know, there was, homosexuality is a Western construct.
Yes.
The word didn't come into use until the late 1800s.
Yeah.
So it's all a construct. And this happens to be our Western construct. At one time, people like me would just be called a person. And what you did sexually was apart from your personhood. But the only way to, there were early gay rights activists who came up with the idea of an identity, that you were a gay person. And then once you had an identity, you could then fight for your rights. So I'm not very good at explaining this. There are people who know much more about it who are better at it. But identity is a construct. Homosexuality, heterosexuality, it's all a 19th century construct.
I love the African-American man's father who said, I don't understand it, but I love you and I accept you. That man you had interviewed, that was so profound.
Yeah.
I think in Friday's New York Times, there was an article on the Sun Current of a Maharaja who...
Yes, I've corresponded with him.
Yeah. Okay, who's been fighting for gay rights in India.
Yes, and I can tell you his name if you give me 1 second. I'll find it while we talk. Hang on 1 second. His name is Prince Manvendra, Manvendra. He's an heir to a famous Indian family, and came out of the closet, was initially cut off by his mother, now accepted, and he's become a major voice in India for LGBT.
I thought he was still not accepted by his mother, but accepted by the rest of the family. I read quickly.
I could be, I may have mixed it up. Very interesting person, and an important figure.
He's actually been on publicity tours in the United States at least several times that I know. He was actually on Oprah.
Yeah, he was here, and he was here in June of last year. I missed him because I was at a wedding.
Of course, Oprah would have been much sooner. I have a question. Actually, it's not a question. It's an observation. You talked about the woman who, when she went into the senior community, decided to go back into the closet. And then later you talked about the couple, the dinosaur couple.
Yes.
Who, in their retirement community experience, created a gay table. I mean, there's no reason why it can't be different for different people's experience. I'm not saying that it should be the same, but it just struck me somehow as you were talking that these are two very different approaches to becoming comfortable in a new environment.
Yes, and they were of different generations.
Yeah, I thought so.
Edith was 20 years older than Barbara and Kay. And when Barbara and Kay, and Edith Ide, whose pen name was Lisa Ben, didn't let me use her real name in the book. So one of the decisions I made when I did the podcast was to use her real name because it was everywhere on the internet by then. But when I did the second edition of the book, I called her and asked her if it would be okay to use her real name 10 years later in 2002. And she said no, she was afraid it would embarrass some of her relatives if it ever got back to them. And it was the same thing about Wendell Sayers, the African-American man whose father accepted him. I used the name Paul Phillips in the book because he didn't want me to use his real name. So when Barbara and Kay went shopping for a retirement community, when they sat down with the director of this retirement community in rural Pennsylvania, they said, first thing, you should know that we have a long history of gay activism. And the director said, oh, I know, I was already warned before you got here. And we are very accepting and very embracing. And one of the things I loved about the gay table was they said they had the largest affinity table of any of the other tables. There was a German language table, a Spanish table, a French table. And they had the most raucous of the tables, and other people wanted to join them. But as one of the women said to me, they speak Spanish at the Spanish table, they speak French at the French table, we speak gay at the gay table, and they are not welcome at our table. But I have to tell you, Kay no longer attends the gay table. Because, well, actually right now nobody's having a gay table because they're all in lockdown. But she stopped a few months before lockdown because she said, these are very suburban people. They only want to talk about their gardens and their houses and their grandchildren. So most of them had been married. And she said, I want to talk about activism. And she said, they're not interested. So Kay stays in touch with her younger friends like me to talk about activism. She doesn't have patience for people who are not interested in the movement. So in a way, I mean, you look at what Kay has done, it'll take these newer generations, it'll take my generation moving into retirement communities or nursing homes to, if not pave the way, to make sure that we're treated appropriately. But for people who are very elderly, as Edith was, she was in her early 90s when she went into the nursing facility, she's very vulnerable, was very vulnerable, and was fearful that she would not be able to fight for herself in a nursing facility. So, and that is the case for many older people, especially older people who grew up in the closet in the first place.
I'm fascinated by what you said about, and please correct me if I misunderstood, about it being a decision to make this an identity, as opposed to one of the many, many facets of human nature, of human behavior in the world. I mean, we all have different ways of doing things in the world, and you can people raise their children to sort of take people as they are, whatever that may, and that would include sexual identity or gender identity. But I'm interested that it was a choice to make it. Do you think that has something to do with American culture, or what, in that we tend to, well, we're right, aren't we, all the time? You know, so you need, you know, to have an identity as an American exceptionalism, whatever you want to call it, says that that's something special. So that do you think in those terms of identity?
Well, Harry Hay, who formulated he called it the call. It was a statement, a 5-page statement about what the Mattachine Society would be. Harry Hay in 1950, in the late 40s to 1950, came up with this idea of identity. But it was really, he followed the writings that from Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, and there were people who wrote even earlier. So I'm not familiar enough to explain what the history of it was, but I do know that the early activists took their cues from the Black Civil Rights Movement, and that was their model for fighting for equal rights. It's different in a way because we look at race differently from sexual identity, and the experience of African Americans in the United States is different from the experience of gay people. And I actually never make that comparison because it's one that's quite contested. I always compare my gay identity to my Jewish identity, which I think is actually more akin to, because that's a construct as well. Because why is it as a Jew, that's my religious heritage. That isn't my identity as a Jewish person. I'm a person, and being Jewish is my religious affiliation. So it's in some ways akin to that. But maybe it is because in the US we look at identity. I don't know. It's a good question, and I wish I were better prepared to answer it.
Thank you.
Eric?
What is the address for the podcast on the Holocaust?
Thosewhowerethere.org. Thosewhowerethere.org. Sorry, Barbara, you were about to say?
I was about to say, I am so grateful to you, my beloved friend. I knew nothing, you know, I knew friendship, but I didn't know history. And recently I discovered a set of 24 lectures on Amazon called The Black Plague. And she was gifted in her presentations. What did I know about the Black plague, rats, fleas, an ugly death, and the depopulation of Europe. And then there was a fifth one about the Mongols throwing infected rats over. And now I know something, 24 lectures worth. And thanks to you, now I have context and I have history, which I will pursue.
I'm so grateful to you, Barbara, for asking me to share this with you and your friends. It's a real privilege.
Well,
Thank you, Eric. Thank you. Wonderful.
Love you, my friend.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Amigos.
Pleasure.